Right now, as you're listening to this, there is a voice in your head.
Yeah, it's probably judging the pacing of the words or, evaluating the audio quality.
Right, or perhaps it's already distracted and like planning what you're going to have for lunch. But here's the unsettling truth we are going to explore today. You didn't tell that voice to start.
No, and you definitely cannot make it stop.
Exactly, and you probably have absolutely no idea where it actually comes from.
It really is the ultimate invisible roommate, right? I mean,
Right.
We spend our entire lives cohabitating with this constant stream of dialogue.
Yeah, and most of us just blindly assume that the voice is us. Why you can't stop thinking.
It's such a fascinating text.
It really is. And our mission over the next little while is to untangle the grand illusion of your internal monologue. We want to figure out who is actually talking inside your head, how the mechanics of that voice operate, and discover why you really shouldn't believe everything it says.
Because the central premise of this text, and it is a wild one, is that thinking isn't something you do. It's something that happens to you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the primary shocker from the text hits right out of the gate. We walk around completely convinced that we are the authors of our thoughts.
Right, but this document argues that we are actually just the audience.
Yes, it's like you've spent your entire life sitting in a grand theater, completely convinced that you are the director of the movie playing in front of you.
Right.
You think you're yelling action and cut, but then the lights come up and you realize you're just sitting in the front row watching a screen.
The script was already written before you even bought a ticket.
Exactly.
That theater analogy captures the illusion perfectly. And what I find so compelling is that this isn't just philosophical musing, We have decades of hard neurological data to back it up.
Oh, wow.
The source material points back to Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s. Libet wanted to find the exact moment conscious free will happens in the brain. Well, he asked participants to do something incredibly simple. He just said, flick your wrist whenever you feel the urge to do so.
Just a basic wrist flick.
Right. But to measure this, he hooked them up to EEG sensors to monitor brain activity and muscle sensors on their wrists.
Okay.
And he had them watch a highly precise, fast-moving clock to note the exact fraction of a second they became consciously aware of their intention to move.
So the timeline in my head is I consciously decide to move my wrist, my brain fires the signal, and then my wrist moves.
Right, that is the sequence we all intuitively feel. But that is not what Libet's instruments recorded.
Wait, what did they record?
The EEG showed that the brain initiated the electrical preparation to move the wrist, a phenomenon called the readiness potential, consistently before the person was consciously aware of deciding to move.
Wait, before?
Yes, the physical, neurological decision routed through the brain first. Then, hundreds of milliseconds later, the person's conscious mind registered the urge.
No way.
Yeah, they didn't author the decision. They merely witnessed the brain's decision and claimed credits for it.
Okay, I have to push back a little here. I get that a wrist flick is largely unconscious. You could argue that's just basic motor function, right? Like
Sure.
almost a reflex handled by lower-level brain systems. But the document says this applies to complex, deliberate thoughts, too. Are you telling me that when I sit down and deliberately weigh the pros and cons of a major career change, I'm not authoring that either?
I am. And what's fascinating here is how modern neuroimaging has taken Libet's foundational work and applied it to those exact types of complex choices.
Okay, how so?
The text highlights recent studies using functional MRI, fMRI machines that track blood flow in the brain. Researchers gave participants complex decisions to make and watched the blood flow routing through the prefrontal and parietal cortexes.
And?
They found that by looking at those blood flow patterns, they could predict which choice a participant was about to make up to 10 seconds before the person consciously reported making the decision.
Wait, 10 seconds?
Yes, 10 seconds.
10 seconds in brain processing time is an absolute eternity.
It is an ocean of time. You sit there in the scanner, completely convinced you are internally deliberating, having this fierce debate in your head.
Right.
But the fMRI shows that the neurological outcome was already determined by background algorithms processing your memories, your biases, your environment.
And consciousness just gets handed the final executive report.
Exactly. We literally mistake the seat we are sitting in for the stage where the action actually happens.
If you're listening to this right now, just try to pause your thoughts for 5 seconds.
It's impossible.
You can't. The voice just keeps going, observing that you're trying to stop it. It's deeply unsettling. But it brings up a huge logical problem for me.
Which is?
If we aren't the ones authoring these thoughts, and the brain is just running on autopilot handing me the final drafts, Why on earth is this script so incredibly stressful?
That is the natural next question.
Right, because if this system's just running on its own, why doesn't it ever just give us a quiet, relaxing show? Why is it always worrying about the electric bill, or planning a hypothetical argument, or stressing out about a weird look a coworker gave me?
It never just chills out.
Exactly. Why is the voice almost never neutral?
To understand the tone of that voice, we have to look at the ancestral evolution of the human brain. The internal monologue was not designed to be a relaxation tool or a source of entertainment.
Right.
It evolved as a highly sensitive, hypervigilant threat monitoring system. Its entire biological job description is to rehearse danger, anticipate failure, and run constant, exhausting simulations of what could go wrong.
Because in an ancestral environment, the relaxed, neutral caveman sitting quietly by the fire was the one who didn't notice the rustling in the bushes.
And he got eaten.
Right.
Precisely. The mind that stayed hyper-alert, the mind that constantly generated terrifying what-if scenarios, survived long enough to pass on its genes.
Okay, that makes sense.
The problem is, human society evolved rapidly, but biological evolution moves at a crawl. We still have that exact same threat monitoring software running, but the environment completely changed around it.
So to an ancient survival system, neutrality feels like a failure to be vigilant. If you aren't worrying, you aren't safe.
Exactly.
It's like keeping a fierce, highly trained guard dog in a modern, secure apartment on the 30th floor.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. It has no actual predators to hunt anymore. There are no rival tribes to fend off. But the dog still has all this instinctual energy, so it just starts barking at the mailman. It barks at your emails.
Yep.
It barks at your awkward social interactions from Tuesday. And it barks relentlessly at your own self-image.
That apartment analogy is brilliant because it highlights the mismatch. The guard dog is still doing its job flawlessly, but the material it has to work with is completely abstract.
It was never trained to stand down.
No. And because this guard dog has lived inside your skull for your entire life, using your internal vocal cords, it genuinely thinks it is you.
And the real trap is that you believe it too.
Absolutely. It has total insider access to your deepest insecurities and speaks with absolute unearned confidence.
It never says, hey, I might be slightly overreacting to this email, but no, it just screams the worst case scenario at you. It tells you you're going to get fired.
Especially at 3 a.m.
Yes. The source document spends a lot of time on this specific hour. Why does this internal guard dog bark the absolute loudest at 3 in the morning?
The 3 a.m. phenomenon is universally experienced but entirely misunderstood in its mechanics. We tend to think of 3 a.m. thoughts as just irrational, sleep-deprived anxiety.
Like we wake up, our heart is racing about a minor deadline, and we brush it off the next morning as the product of just being overtired.
Right, the classic, everything looks worse in the dark mentality. We assume our brain is just misfiring because it needs sleep.
But the text says otherwise.
Yes, the source material reframes this entirely through the lens of cognitive load. Think of your brain's processing power as bandwidth.
Okay.
During the day, you have a massive amount of sensory input and performance demands occupying that bandwidth. You have your job, you have to navigate traffic, you hold conversations, you scroll on your phone.
So there's a lot going on.
All of that acts as a heavy filter, a wall of noise that drowns out the underlying threat monitoring monologue.
It's like having the radio turned all the way up in the car so you don't hear the engine making a weird clanking sound.
Yes, perfect. But at 3 a.m., the competition for your cognitive bandwidth completely disappears. You are lying in a dark, silent room. The social filters that keep you functioning drop away. The daytime noise stops.
And what surfaces?
What surfaces in that quiet isn't just amplified anxiety. The text calls it deferred reality.
Deferred reality. Wow.
Because it is the backlog of unresolved emotional data that you successfully avoided processing all day long.
Yeah.
When the distractions are removed, the guard dog finally has your undivided attention to present its daily threat report.
So it's not irrational exhaustion, it's just the stuff I ran out of ways to ignore.
The recurring 3 a.m. thought is never actually irrational. It is unresolved. Irrational thoughts dissolve when the sun comes up. Unresolved thoughts come back every single night until you deal with the underlying emotion.
So in a very uncomfortable way, the 3 a.m. version of you, stripped of your daytime performance and your coping mechanisms, is actually the most honest version of you.
Stripped of the daytime performance, yeah.
It really hits hard. If you're listening to this and you regularly wake up at 3 a.m. dreading something, maybe the goal isn't to try and force yourself back to sleep, but to actually listen to what the deferred reality is trying to tell you.
Exactly. Though we have to be careful about how we listen, because the threat monitor has some very toxic habits.
Which brings us to a major pivot in the document. Because the guard dog doesn't just bark at present threats or future anxieties.
Oh, it loves the past.
Yes. Reading through these sources, it seems its absolute favorite late-night activity is chewing on old bones, specifically replaying the past. I want to talk about rumination.
Okay, let's do it.
Why do we ruminate on things we literally cannot change? Why does the brain torture us with the memory of something embarrassing we said at a party 5 years ago? If the threat monitor is designed to keep us safe in the future, why is it looking backward?
It comes down to how the brain categorizes unresolved information. On a functional level, the brain treats emotionally unresolved memories as open files.
And it hates open files.
It hates them. It wants to process them, categorize them, and close them. But rumination isn't the brain calmly reflecting on the past to extract a logical lesson. The text makes a crucial distinction here. Rumination is a failed attempt at revision.
Wait, revision? Meaning the brain is actually trying to change what happened in the past? That makes no logical sense.
Consciously, we know it makes no sense. But subconsciously, the threat monitor is running the exact same painful simulation over and over again, tweaking variables, hoping that this time it will generate a different emotional output.
Oh, wow.
And here is where the mechanics of human memory make this incredibly dangerous. We like to think of memory as a video file we just pull up and play. But neurological recall is actually a process of reconstruction.
Wait, reconstruction?
Yes.
Yes.
Every single time you retrieve a memory, you bring it into a malleable state. You literally rewire the neural pathway before putting it back.
That is wild. It's like a Wikipedia page of your own life that you keep angrily editing in your head.
Yes.
You go in to look at the memory of that party, tweak a detail, make yourself look a little more foolish, make the other person's reaction look a little more judgmental, and then you save those edits.
Exactly.
Eventually, the original facts of what actually happened are completely gone, and you've built this increasingly detailed, hypercritical fiction that just makes you feel significantly worse.
That is a flawless way to visualize it. You suffer over that edited fiction as if it were historical fact. The original draft of that event no longer exists anywhere in your neurological architecture.
But you might ask, why doesn't the conscious mind step in and say, hey, we are exaggerating this?
Right.
Like, why do we fall for our own bad editing?
Because the mind sets an incredibly elegant trap for itself. The brain uses the real, physiological, emotional pain you're feeling right now as undeniable evidence that the memory must be accurate.
I feel physically terrible right now. My stomach is in knots. Therefore, this terrible, catastrophic version of the story I'm telling myself must be exactly what happened.
Yes, the emotional weight acts as false confirmation of reality. The brain conflates the intensity of the feeling with the truth of the narrative.
I see this happen most clearly in what I think is the ultimate form of rumination, something I am absolutely guilty of, the shower argument.
Oh, the shower argument. We all do it.
Yeah. You are standing there, shampooing your hair, aggressively rehearsing the absolute perfect comeback for an unfinished conversation you had 3 weeks ago. You are gesturing, your heart rate is up, you are furious at a bottle of conditioner.
The unfinished conversation is one of the threat monitor's most consuming projects. But the reality check the source material provides here is brutal. The actual person you are arguing with in your head is likely sleeping perfectly well or going about their day completely unbothered. They aren't in the shower with you.
Metaphorically speaking.
Right. The entity in your head isn't them. It is your own construction of them. You are essentially arguing with your own unresolved feelings of inadequacy or anger, and those feelings are just wearing someone else's face like a mask.
Because I am the one who gave them the script. I wrote their dialogue to make sure they hit my exact insecurities, just so I could deliver the perfect rehearsed comeback.
You wrote both sides of the script, and you gave the fandom version of them infinite patience to keep arguing back. That is exactly why a shower argument can go on indefinitely. You don't end the argument by finding the perfect words to win it in your head. You can only end it by stopping the need for the argument.
Stopping the need.
The argument only exists because there is an underlying emotional wound that hasn't been acknowledged. Once you face the actual wound, maybe the fact that you felt disrespected or unheard, the imaginary argument completely loses its charge. It dissolves.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because if we are constantly arguing with our own unresolved feelings wearing someone else's face, whose voice is actually doing the arguing on our end, the source material highlights a chilling detail about this. This internal monologue, this voice in your head, has an accent. It has a tone, a specific emotional register, a vocabulary, and a character that you absolutely did not choose.
This is the point where the deep dive crosses from neurology into developmental psychology. Where does the specific character, the specific attitude of your inner critic come from?
Right.
The text points out that it is constructed from everyone who spoke to you before you had the cognitive development or the language skills to question them.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I'm getting this. When I make a mistake at work, and I immediately think to myself, I should have known better, that was so stupid, I'm always messing this up. That isn't me holding myself accountable. I always just assumed that was my own standard of excellence pushing me.
I would strongly push back on the idea that that is your original voice. Your inner critic rarely uses your authentic voice. It uses a composite of voices from early authorities in your life.
Really?
Early childhood is a period of intense neural plasticity. Before you develop an ego, a sense of self that can filter information and say, I disagree with that, You're just a sponge absorbing the environment.
Okay.
So it could be the impatience of a parent, the harsh standard of third-grade teacher, an older sibling, or even a friend who made you feel small in middle school. You internalize their tones and their judgments so completely at such a young age that you now experience them as your own spontaneous thoughts.
That is horrifying. That means someone else's judgment is running on my hardware.
It is the ultimate Trojan horse. These voices were installed without your consent, long before you had a fully formed self to protect the gates.
So if an early authority figure believed you weren't particularly capable or that you needed to be perfect to be loved?
That limitation was installed like a foundational software update.
Wow.
Now, decades later, it operates inside you as your own self-assessment. We spend our entire adult lives living under someone else's ceiling, and we mistakenly call it self-knowledge.
We think we are bumping up against our own limits when really we are just hitting the walls of a cage someone else built for us.
Exactly.
That is a lot to take in. Just the idea that the limits I feel aren't even mine, it really shifts the perspective. But it leads to a very obvious, almost urgent question.
Go for it.
If the voice in our head isn't ours, if we aren't the authors, if it constantly runs these stressful simulations, barks at non-existent threats, and uses a borrowed accent from my third-grade teacher to make me miserable, why is it so incredibly hard to just let the thoughts go? If it's an uninvited guest causing me pain, why do I cling to it? Why does the idea of stopping the thought process feel so impossible?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we hit the absolute deepest mechanism at play in human consciousness. It is not just about bad habits or evolutionary design or childhood trauma. It is about how consciousness sustains its own existence.
Okay, I'm listening.
The continuity of thought is how the brain maintains the continuity of self.
Meaning the constant chatter of the voice is how I know I am me.
Precisely. The internal monologue creates the illusion of a persistent entity moving through time. I was me yesterday, I am me today, I will be me tomorrow.
Right.
When that voice stops, like it does in moments of deep, profound meditation or under heavy anesthesia or in those liminal moments right before we fall asleep, that sense of a coherent, bounded narrative self temporarily dissolves.
And the brain doesn't like that dissolution.
The brain doesn't just dislike it, it registers that silence as a mortal threat. To the survival instinct, the dissolution of the narrative self is indistinguishable from biological annihilation. Death.
So to clarify this for you listening, even a miserable, agonizing, self-critical thought generates the feeling that you exist.
Yes.
The survival instinct in our brains cannot distinguish between actual physical death and the quiet dissolution of our inner storyline. It thinks if the story stops, the organism dies. So we will literally choose the pain of a toxic thought over the silence of not existing.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of the human condition.
Yeah.
Most people will choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar silence every single time.
Wow.
Not because they're weak, not because they lack willpower, but because the alternative feels like disappearing entirely into the void.
Right.
The mind keeps talking, even if it's saying terrible things, just to prove to itself that it's still there.
So what does this all mean? If I'm listening to this right now, maybe driving in my car or walking the dog, and I'm realizing I'm not the author of my thoughts, my inner critic is just a mixtape of stressed out adults from my childhood, and my brain thinks stopping this noise is the equivalent of dying. What is the play here? What are we supposed to actually do with this heavy realization?
The paradox of the source material's conclusion is that you don't actually do anything to stop it. The question itself, what do I do, assumes there is an action to take, a switch to flip, an enemy to defeat. But you cannot fight the mind with the mind.
Because fighting a thought with another thought is just giving the guard dog more things to bark at.
Exactly. But awareness changes the entire dynamic. Not immediately, and certainly not by magically muting the voice forever.
Right.
The goal isn't to force the silence. The goal is to deeply, fundamentally realize that you are not inside the voice. You're the awareness watching the voice.
You are stepping out of the movie on the screen and taking your seat back in the theater.
Right. When you understand the mechanics, when you see that the voice is inherited, that the 10-second fMRI study proves it's automatic, you stop taking its judgments as absolute truth.
That makes total sense.
When you know that rumination is just a failed attempt at revision, you can recognize what your brain is doing when it brings up that 5-year-old memory. You don't get mad at it. You just say, the brain is doing that revision thing again.
You recover the ability to think your own deliberate thoughts, rather than just blindly accepting the ones handed to you by this ancient threat monitoring system.
You could observe the noise at 3 a.m. and just choose not to believe every single word it says. You watch it happen, rather than being kidnapped by it.
So the voice will still be there.
The voice will still be there. The guard dog will still occasionally bark. But you stop being entirely at its mercy. And that gap, that tiny little space between the thought happening and you automatically believing it, is where your actual freedom lives.
That is a phenomenal place to land, and it completely reframes our relationship with our own minds. Which brings me to a final thought for you, the learner. Since we now know this voice is essentially an uninvited guest running on your mental hardware, using someone else's accent, what would happen if you started treating it like one?
I love that.
Next time that inner critic chimes in with some harsh judgment or a stressful 3 a.m. simulation, imagine just mentally saying, "Thank you for your input," the exact same way a polite manager dismisses an overzealous intern who just suggested a terrible idea. If you stop fighting the voice, stop arguing with the ghosts in the shower, and start politely ignoring it, how long until that guard dog finally decides to lay down and go to sleep? Enjoy observing the stage in your mind today.